Hello, fellow readers and booktubers, and I'd like to welcome you to the Roman Emperor's Reading Challenge, Augustus, Part 1. I had posted about this, I had posted a tag about this idea I had for a Roman Emperor's Reading Challenge. I think I posted this about a month or two ago. Initially, I was challenging myself. I was going to read at least one biography of each Roman emperor during the first 200 years in the age of the Principate, or the age of the emperors. And the response I got was very enthusiastic, and a lot of you wanted to join me on this journey, and you're certainly welcome aboard. But I thought, since so many of you would kind of like to read along with me, I thought it might be a good idea to begin with a broad introduction to Roman history. Roman history is a huge topic, and it can be quite overwhelming at times. The history of ancient Rome covers about 1,300 years of history, and a lot of things happened during that time. So what I want to do, this post on the Emperor Augustus, who was the first of the Roman emperors, it will have two parts to it. Future emperors, I'll probably just one post on each emperor. But with Augustus, this is part one, and this is more an introduction to Roman history in general. And then part two, I'll post something about the Emperor Augustus and a biography that I read of Augustus. So this is kind of an introduction to Roman history. Again, I'm painting with a very broad brush here. I just want to hit on the fine points and get us to the moment when Augustus when he essentially appears on the scene. So when it comes to Roman history, where does it all begin? Some of you are probably familiar with the story of Romulus and Remus, the twin divine sons who found Rome. And, it's certainly a myth and a legend, but generally speaking, it seems that something happened on top of the Palatine Hill, which overlooks the Tiber River, which is in central Rome today. It's one of the 7 hills, around the middle of the 8th century BC. That's the earliest sign of any human habitation in that area. So whatever else the story about Romulus and Remus is or is not real, when the Romans tell us their city was founded about 750 BC before Christ, or 750 BCE before the Common Era, they have the date right. In fact, they put a finer point on it, 753 BC, the founding of Rome by Romulus and Remus. Now, something to be pointed out here, they say the founding of the city. Rome did not start out as a city. Of course it didn't. It started out as a tribal camp, maybe 1,000 people, mostly men. And they gather on top of the Palatine Hill and they claim it for themselves. According to legend, Romulus and Remus had a conflict between them, and Romulus will kill Remus. Romulus kills his brother Remus, and so this encampment, this village on top of this hill, will be named for him. Romulus, better pronounced as Romulus, so the city of Romulus is Rome. That's where it all starts. And Romulus will organize his group, this tribe that he's leading, and he essentially will become the first king of Rome. So Romulus is not only the founder of Rome, he's the first king of Rome. And for about the first 200 years in Roman history, Rome is governed as a monarchy. There are a succession of kings. This is very common in the ancient world. All ancient cities claim, first of all, divine foundations, and then that they're ruled by kings. Now, and the time of the Roman monarchy goes from 753 BC to 509 BC, about 250 years. This is a period of Roman history that we don't know much about. There's so much myth and legend. It's hard to verify anything. The Romans know all about it, but the information they're giving us, the information we have from the Romans was written centuries after the fact. They do give us the names of the kings. There were 7 of them, Romulus being the first. And it would seem with each successive king, this village on top of the hill became larger, and they begin to, the population grows, and they begin to move down the sides of the hill. They move up the next hill, the Capitoline. The valley between the Palatine and the Capitoline becomes the Roman Forum, the marketplace. Then the Romans' population continues to grow. They seize control of some of the other surrounding hills, and then they come into conflict with some of the other tribal groups in the area. Some they conquer, others join the Romans, and so the village becomes a town, the town becomes a city, and by the end of the 6th century BC, Rome is a substantially large city. There's no empire yet, and Rome is not ruling Italy yet. It's just a big, prosperous city about 20 miles from the coast, the western coast of Italy, about midway down the peninsula of Italy, which gives it great strategic importance as well. But that's all it is. It's not ruling Italy. It certainly isn't an empire, but it is a prosperous city. Somewhere in there, towards the end of the time of the kings, the Romans will call this the age of royal Rome, or the Roman monarchy. Either one works. Towards the end of that period of Roman history, Rome apparently had been conquered by the Etruscans. The Etruscans were a very powerful people who dominated northern Italy, because the Romans will tell us that the last of their kings was an Etruscan. And they give us a name, Tarquinius Superbus. Now, Superbus isn't a name. It's not a proper name. It's a description. It means the haughty one, the arrogant one. And Tarquinius there's an Etruscan city north of Rome called Tarquini. So it would seem like the name of the last king was the arrogant man from Tarquini. Anyway, he's an Etruscan. And the Romans resent being ruled by someone who isn't a Roman. And this Tarquinius Superbus individual is incredibly arrogant. He treats the Romans with contempt. By this time, the Romans had an aristocracy, powerful families, and he treated them badly. He did not respect the Roman gods and the Roman social institutions. And at one point, Tarquinius Superbus' son raped Lucretia. Some of you might be familiar with this in ancient mythologies or even in Renaissance art. There's tons of paintings called the Rape of Lucretia. It's referring to this event that the Romans tell us occurred around 509 BC. Lucretia was a Roman noblewoman. Her father was a Roman senator, and I believe her husband was also a Roman senator. But she was raped by the son of the evil king. And to the Romans, that was the final indignity. So they rose up and they drove out the king, and the Romans vowed that they would never again be ruled by kings. And in the Roman political consciousness, the idea of kingship or monarchy, the Romans would associate that with tyranny, a tyrannical government. And the Romans believed that if you found yourself ruled by a tyrant, it was the duty of all good men to rise up against the tyrant and drive him out, kill him if possible. That's where we get the word tyrannicide from. So with the collapse of the Roman monarchy, we then enter into the next phase of Roman history, the age of the Republic. And this will go from about 509 BC to 27 BC, about 500 years. And it's during this time that Rome becomes more and more powerful. Now that they've done away with the monarchy, they create a republican style of government. That's republican with a small r. In other words, representative government. They'll have magistrates, they'll have a senate, and they'll have popular assemblies. The Romans are known for a great many things, and one of them is their ability to organize very efficiently. Now, this republican form of government, it didn't always work well, but it usually did. And at the same time, the Romans are building an army so they can defend their interests, and their armies are very well organized. So during that 500 years of the Roman Republic, the Romans begin to conquer far and wide. And first, they'll conquer essentially all of Italy, and that's completed by 330 BC. And then that large island at the toe of Italy is called Sicily. The Romans will then conquer Sicily. They'll control that by 212. And then over the next 10 years, they go on to conquer the rest of the Western Mediterranean world. Rome's conquest of the Western Mediterranean meant that the Romans were battling the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians were people the city of Carthage was on the north coast of Africa. The wars between the Romans and the Carthaginians are bloody and deadly and fairly well documented because now Rome is a great power. And Carthage was Rome's rival for control of the Mediterranean Sea. And Rome emerges victorious at this time. Those wars are called the Punic Wars. You might be wondering how come they're not called the Carthaginian Wars. Sometimes they are. But the reason they're called the Punic Wars is because the Carthaginians were Phoenician. I guess you could say by ethnicity. And the Latin word for a Phoenician is a punica. To call one of them a Carthaginian means you come from the city of Carthage. But as a people, you're Phoenician, you're Punica. So those are the famous Punic Wars. And it's at that time, as in the Second Punic War, that other very famous episode that everyone seems to know at least a little bit about, of Hannibal crossing the Alps with his elephants. It occurs during the Second Punic War. At any rate, by the year 200, give or take, Rome is now controlling the Western Mediterranean. They then become involved in events in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Eastern Mediterranean is the Hellenic world. Of course, it involves Greece, but Greece and then points east like modern-day Turkey, all of Syria and Lebanon, all those territories, and even Egypt. It was called the Hellenic world. And the Romans got involved in this, and over a period of about a century, they eventually end up conquering most of it. It comes under Roman control. And so now, by around the year 100 BC, Rome, for all intents and purposes, is an empire. It is the strongest, most dominant city-state in the Mediterranean world. And they've got the most efficient armies. They've lost some battles along the way, but they haven't lost any wars, and they're controlling everything. At the same time, because Rome had become so successful, a lot of wealth and power was pouring into the city itself. And that meant that some very ambitious Roman families and Roman military commanders began to have dreams of controlling empire, of having ultimate power. And so from about 133 BC to about 27 BC, these dates have meanings, and we'll get into that probably in the next episode. It's a period known as the Roman Revolution. That's what historians call it. It's not what the Romans called it. But what happened was that Republican political creation of the Romans, which had served Rome so well, begins to buckle under the pressure of ambition and greed and military strongmen and political demagoguery. And so during that 100 years, the last 100 years of the Roman Republic, this will be the age of the Spartacus slave revolt occurs at that time, because the Romans have conquered so much, they've acquired so many slaves that the slaves outnumber the free people in Italy, and they rise up under Spartacus. It's crushed by the Roman military. But at the same time, you start to hear about people like Cicero, the great Roman statesman, who was sounding the alarm. The Roman Republic cannot withstand all of this greed and ambition. And then you get Mark Antony, and you get Cleopatra, and then ultimately you get Julius Caesar. And then finally, all of this starts to crumble, and the Republic will come to an end, and we enter the third and final phase of Roman history, the Principate, the time of the first citizen, better known as the Age of the Emperors, and that begins with Augustus. Now, I fudged a couple of decades in there about where does Augustus fit into this. Augustus was born about the year 63 BC. That was about 10 years after the Spartacus slave revolt. He is the adopted son of Julius Caesar. And what happens there is, well, that's part of the story of Augustus, and we'll get into that a little bit. I just wanted to touch upon kind of a broad outline of Roman history up until the time just before Augustus becomes the dominant power in Rome. So you've got the monarchy, the republic, the collapse of the republic, and then that last 100 years of the Roman Republic, the empire, by the way, was racked by civil wars. This wasn't just politicians arguing. These were politicians killing each other. These were politicians raising armies, Roman legions fighting Roman legions. It's quite a dynamic and chaotic time. So that's the broad view of Roman history. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Roman political system during the time of the Republic. And again, I'm painting with a broad brush here. I just want you to understand certain aspects of this so you can better appreciate what it was that Augustus did and how his presence in Roman history represents a tremendous alteration of the Republic. The Roman political system during the Republic worked like this. You didn't have a king anymore, and there's no emperor. You would have magistrates. These were elected officials, elected annually. And the magistrates were essentially the men who made the laws and also maintained the running of the Roman state. And then below the magistrates was the Roman Senate. The Roman Senate is the one persistent political body in Roman history. There was a Senate during the time of the kings. The Roman senators were advisors to the kings. There are senators during the time of the Republic, and there will be senators during the time of the emperors. During the time of the Republic, the senators were descendants of the original Romans, the original families that helped to found the city of Rome. At least that was the claim. The Senate didn't make any laws. The magistrates made the laws. But what the Senate represented was they were the true Romans. They were descendants of the true Romans. So if you were a magistrate and you proposed a law, you had to bring it before the Senate for the Senate approval. And if you didn't do that, if you ignored the senators might tag you as a tyrant, and then you might get yourself killed for all your trouble. It's kind of interesting. The Roman Senate was not an elective body. This was a legacy. You would inherit it from your father or your uncle or some other male relative who had retired from the Senate, and he would pass the title on to you. So it's not an elective body. The Senate doesn't make laws, but they were the most respected of Romans. And this was all about tradition. They had this aura of power. Everything had to be deferred to the Senate to get the Senate's advice and approval. So the Roman Republic, the magistrates, and the magistrates existed on a hierarchy. There were the lesser magistrates and the greater magistrates. It was a ladder of power. But the magistrates, they ran the state and they made the laws. So these are the politicians controlling the state. Then there's the senators, and their real job is to maintain the traditions of Rome that kept Rome great. Then there was, you might think of it as a third branch of the Roman government, and those were the popular assemblies. And the popular assemblies would vote. They were the ones who voted for magistrates, who the magistrates would be. And outside of that, they didn't really have much of a say in anything unless, a magistrate would propose a law, he would get the approval of the Senate, and then the law might be put to a vote before the popular assemblies, sometimes, but not all the time. When Rome becomes an empire, there was a Greek by the name of Polybius who had kind of observed this, and he was wondering, how did Rome so quickly become an empire? And his belief was the Romans accomplished this because of their form of government. He would argue that the Romans had created a mixed government of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And those were regarded as the three finest forms of government. And so Polybius says, well, the magistrates essentially represent a kind of monarchy. They've just delegated power among themselves. The Senate represents an aristocracy, the defenders of the tradition. And the popular assemblies, of course, represented democracy. And Polybius was quite in awe of this. That's a pretty good explanation for how the Roman Republic survived for so long and how they were able to create an empire. So anyway, that's kind of how the Roman system worked, and sometimes it worked better than at other times. Now here's some important terms to keep in mind with this. When I talk about the Roman magistrates existing on a ladder of power, at the lower rungs were the quaestors and the aediles and all of that, and as you moved up through the rungs, more and more power was accrued to you. Of course, you would have to be elected to these offices. The most powerful of the Roman magistrates were the consuls. They had ultimate power within the Roman state during the age of the Republic. Now, of course, the Romans, always fearful of a tyranny, they made sure that 2 consuls were elected every year. 2 men with tremendous power, the most political power in the state, but 2 of them governing simultaneously to keep each other in check. That way, the Romans wouldn't have to worry about a tyrant. So the consulship was the ultimate goal of any politically ambitious Roman. So that's what a consul is. There's supposed to always be 2 of them. Also, at some point early in the history of the Roman Republic, they created another political office, the office of the Tribune, or the Tribune of the plebeians. The tribunes were Roman politicians whose responsibility was to protect the Roman people in case the magistrates became too corrupted or too drunk on power. So if the magistrates proposed a law, and if they got the approval of the Senate, before they could announce the law or enforce the law to the Roman people, the tribunes could step in. And if the tribunes saw that there was something about that law that might cause harm to the Roman people, the tribunes could literally yell out, "I forbid the passage of this law." And the Latin word for "I forbid" is veto. The tribunes had veto power. They could stop the enforcement of a law. See? This worked pretty well for the Romans for quite a long time, but that's what a tribune was. And these titles, consul, tribune, the other magistrates, you've got praetors and quaestors and all that, these were also military titles. In the Roman political state and the Roman military state were all melded into one thing. If you were a Roman politician, you were expected to be willing to give your life for Rome. In fact, it was expected you already had some military experience under your belt. The Romans didn't. They would have scoffed at the idea of a politician who had never fought in a war sending off their youth to battle somewhere else in the empire. No, the Romans said, if you want to govern the state, you have to show your loyalty and your willingness to die for the state. So all these ranks, the Roman magisterial ranks, are also military ranks. You'll hear a lot more about that when you start reading about Augustus. There's another title called the Dictator. Now, when the Romans talked about a dictator, they did not mean what we mean by that. When we talk about a dictator, we think of people like Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin, men who seize power by extra-legal means, and then they wield that power for their own benefit. The Romans would have called men like that tyrants. We've already kind of alluded to that. When the Romans talk about a dictator, this was a political office. It was an appointment that would be given to someone by the senators and by the magistrates during times of great crisis. In other words, Rome is in great danger, and prompt and immediate action must be taken. So the magistrates would recommend to the Senate, we need to name someone dictator. And so they would name someone a dictator, and they would always choose someone who has great experience with power. He's shown he can wield power with great responsibility, and someone who will be loyal to Rome. And if you were named dictator, for 6 months you would have absolute power. Everyone had to obey everything you said, and then just tremendous power. And then after 6 months, you had to lay down that power, and if you didn't, you'd be marked for death. The Romans would name dictators off and on during moments of crisis throughout its history. During the Punic Wars, there were a few dictators. It was a very special office, and it was guarded carefully by the Senate and the magistrate, but it was an office of tremendous power, but there was that limitation on it. After 6 months, you had to surrender that power. Eventually, this office will be abused, as we will see. And then there's the other Roman title of Imperator. This was not an official political title. This was a term or a title you would be given by your legions. Imperator means conquering general. So if you're leading your armies into battle and you conquer a city, and you do it with a minimum of danger to your men, or I shouldn't say that, if your men were all allowed to demonstrate their strength and bravery, and they win the battle, your legions might hail you as the Imperator, the conquering general. It was a great honor. Not an official title, but a great honor for any Roman, and a Roman, politically ambitious Roman, to have been hailed as Imperator by your legions. That carried a lot of weight. The reason I'm mentioning this is that Imperator is where we get the word emperor from. Imperator means conquering general or victorious general. And it's where the word emperor comes from. And it's important. And you'll see that when you start reading about Augustus. I'm going to let that hang there for now. And by the way, Augustus, that's not a name, it's a title. It means the honored one, or it could mean the blessed one. Or, that's where we get the word august. We can call someone august. Someone is just glowing or blessed by the gods. That's what Augustus is. In fact, Augustus's real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, better known as Octavian. He had been adopted by Julius Caesar, so he would get a Julius Caesar as part of his name. The Roman naming thing is a whole other field of study, but at any rate. So those are some of the basics. I hope I didn't confuse you too much. One more thing that's also very important is to keep in mind that in the ancient world, there was no such thing as a separation of church and state. It was all melded into one, and particularly in Rome. I think they didn't have a church, but the Roman cultic system, the gods and how they were worshipped and the rituals that surrounded all that and how they governed the state and how they ran their military, it was this one gummed up thing. Very, very powerful and very influential. And you're going to hear a lot about the gods. And by the time of the age of the emperors, the Romans seem to have become rather cynical about the gods, but they're always looking for signs from the gods. And some of these powerful figures we're going to be looking at will manipulate those signs to their own benefit. So there's that too. Now, How do we know all this about the Romans? Well, the Romans left behind a lot of writing, not as much as you might think, but it's enough, and the Greeks as well. Greece was still around when Rome becomes an empire. The Greek Golden Age was long past, but Greece was still recognized as this very cultural center. Athens was like the great university town to the Roman aristocracy. But so the Greeks and the Romans, they left behind a lot of written material. There's not as much there as you might think, but there's enough to reconstruct a lot of these Roman political systems and the Roman culture and the society at the time. So these sources, they're called the original sources. That's what historians look at. And when it comes to the biographies of, say, Augustus, we've got Suetonius, who wrote a thing called The Lives of the 12 Caesars. This is an edition of Suetonius. It's got the original Latin in it. If you went on to graduate school, you'd have to use this one. There's a more popular version of Suetonius, one of the Penguin classics, The 12 Caesars. But Suetonius isn't the only source we have for Augustus, and he's not necessarily the most reliable source. Suetonius liked to gossip. But anyway, he gives us a lot of information. And then, of course, we've got, there are stele engravings. There's a famous one in which Augustus is kind of like he's writing his own autobiography. It's called the Res Gesta, where Augustus recounts all of his great conquests and all the wonderful things he did. So historians look at these things, and of course we have to weigh them. How reliable is this? And when it came to Augustus, though, he became such a beloved figure among the Romans. In fact, he becomes deified, he becomes a god, that everybody wrote about Augustus. So there's a lot of information out there about him. When historians gather this information together and kind of give it some kind of form, for people who are just with a passing interest in it, they create what are known as secondary sources. Okay? Now, there's two kinds of secondary source. There are the academic secondary sources. This would be an historian who is writing about some aspect of Augustus's reign, or some aspect of Augustus's political machinations, or Augustus as a military leader, or Augustus as the head of the Roman cultic system. Very specialized stuff. Academic writings assume that the reader already knows a lot about Roman history, so they don't give you a lot of background information. But then, thankfully, there are the popular histories, a popular biography of Augustus, often written by very good historians, but they're writing for a broad general audience. And usually, the first couple of chapters, they'll give you a lot of the background, very similar to what I just told you. And as far as Augustus is concerned, this was the first book. This is the one that I recommended. I still stand by that. I know some of you got this one by Anthony Everitt. It's not the only biography of Augustus, though. Now, this is not a primary source, but it is based on the original sources. Everitt's just a great historian. He put it all together, and he creates a narrative. It's like a story. It's reading a story. It's very interesting. It's not the only biography of Augustus. There are a number of others. One that was written a little bit after Everitt's book was the one by Goldsworthy, Augustus, the First Emperor of Rome. There are many, many others out there. If you want to join me on this journey of reading a biography of each of the Roman emperors, choose whatever one you want, but choose carefully. Make sure you get a more popular history and not one of the more scholarly academic ones, or you're going to get lost, unless you've already studied Roman history, in which case, have at it. So now, how am I going to proceed with all of this? In about 2 weeks, I'm going to post part 2 of this one, and it'll be about the Emperor Augustus. And it'll be like a typical post. I'll give you my overview of a biography of Augustus. I think I'm going to go with the Goldsworthy one, and I'll tell you what what Augustus was like, what we know about Augustus, and what Goldsworthy thinks of him. Now, some of you might be reading the Everitt book. I've been asked by some people, if you read one biography of someone, why would you read another biography about the same person? Well, every historian has a different view of that individual, and Augustus invokes a lot of interesting opinions. Very few people are on the fence about Augustus. There's some things about his history, his biography, that are kind of curious. So anyway, if you want to read this one, by all means, you can read this one, and it will serve you just as well if this is the biography that I'm talking about. It's not going to, the basics are all going to be the same. It'll just be a different viewpoint. At any rate, at the moment, my technical skills are not the best. I'm not real comfortable with setting up like a Zoom meeting, or I know I've received some wonderful help from Pat at Book Chat with Pat about the different, I think they're apps you can set up where I can talk with you directly at a given time, and we can have discussion groups and all that. I'm not real solid with that yet. I think some of the future emperors, I can start doing that kind of thing. So for this first project, and I want to get this underway before we get too far into the new year, what I'm going to do is, in about 2 weeks, in fact, 2 weeks from today, let's say that, okay? 2 weeks from today, which will be, let's see, this is the 13th, so anyway, do the math. 2 weeks from today on a Monday, I'll do my part 2 of Augustus, my first post about that particular emperor. And then I'll do it like a regular post. I'll include some prompts, and you can respond to the prompts. And you can respond with comments. And then I'll respond to your comments, or we can kind of go back and forth that way, just the way you would with any kind of posting on BookTube or on YouTube. Also, I would like to mention, if you have any questions as you're reading whatever biography of Augustus you choose, feel free to email me. I have an email address that's just for BookTube, and I'll include that in the comments section below. So if you have any questions about any of this, I would only ask that you be patient. I might not be able to get back to you right away. I am employed, and I have to pay the rent. But I'll try to get back. I'll try to answer every email you send to me. So anyway, that's the deal. I've given you some broad background in Roman history. I've placed Augustus within that era of history. I've talked about the primary sources. We're not going with the primary sources. We're going with the secondary sources, the more contemporary biographies of Augustus. If you want to read the Everitt, I've read this one already. If you want to go with that one, fine. If you want to go with Goldsworthy, that's fine too, or any other biography of Augustus, although I strongly recommend you get a popular biography and not an academic one. And I think that's all I've got to tell you for now. Happy reading. Keep reading. Always read. It's time to start reading about Augustus, and I'm looking forward to your comments for this post and for the post I'm going to put up 2 weeks from now. And also, please feel free to email me about this if you have any kind of questions or need any clarification. But I think I've given you enough background. I hope I have. That's it for now. Happy reading, and I'll be talking to you all soon.